Considering how many thousands of BT-7s were built, it's proving surprisingly difficult to find one in somewhat intact condition. We've had to come as far as Minsk, a place called the Stalin Line, to find what they claim to be the last operational BT-7 in the world. Now, there are going to be a couple of variances with history because in order to keep it going, they've had to make a few modifications. We'll come to those later. The BTs were the fast tanks. They were the accompanying vehicles to the infantry support tanks such as T-26. The lineage of the BT goes back to an American designer by the name of J. Walter Christie. Now, Christie was a bit of an eccentric and he was obsessed by speed. He basically didn't make tanks, he made sports cars that had a gun and tracks, and even the tracks were optional, you can run it usually on wheels. But if you look at the T3 or T4 medium tanks that he sold the US Army, and then you compare those to the BT-2, you can see the lineage from the T4 to the 2, to the BT-5 to the BT-7. It's all a whole family evolution of a similar pattern of tank. As ever, we're going to be taking a tour of the vehicle, starting with the exterior and then moving inside. So there's no better place to start the exterior than at the front. Now, the first thing to notice about the hull, A, it's all welded, which is a bit of an innovation for the BT series. Also, it's pointed. So not only do you have the slope on the vertical axis, you also have one on the horizontal. Bearing in mind that this is an early 30s design, there's actually not very much complicated else about it. The front slope is dominated by the two-piece driver's hatch, which simply folds forward and up. Outside of that, you've got the two headlights, two tow hooks, and a horn on the left-hand side. That's it. Track tension, as you can imagine, is simple and old school. It is adjusted in the normal manner by moving the idler wheel forwards and backwards. In order to do this, you unlock a locking nut here, it disengages the teeth. You then get a large lever, insert it into the notch here, and you simply lever the idler wheel up or down. Because it's on an eccentric arm, it'll move forwards and backwards. When you're in the right position, tighten the locking nut again, the teeth will mesh, and you're fixed in position and good to go off on your merry way. And now the fun bit, the suspension, which is going to be pretty much unique to the BT-7 of all the vehicles and inside the hatch. Start off simply enough with the track. 46 links per side, a very simple form of construction. There is a guide tooth on every other link, held together by single pins. Each pin is held in place by a small little cotter pin. As we move back to the number one road wheel, the very first thing you're going to see is the steering mechanism. Now remember, Christie didn't just make tanks, he made sports cars. He wanted them to go fast, and if you didn't need to use the tracks, you could take off the tracks in about 30 minutes, and you could run the tank much faster and quieter and with much less wear and tear on the wheels alone. Now, of course, to do this, you now have to steer. The different varying speeds isn't going to do the job. The suspension for wheels 2 and 3 are the same. This is a center guide for a large coil spring. Now, if I were to lie down on the ground and look up, I would see this is simply a protective covering, and there is a large spring which coils around the center guide. As the road wheel arm moves up and down, it compresses the spring. That gives us the large range of motion that Christie's suspension was famous for. Auxiliary tanks. Now, this could be used for either petrol or for oil, but usually it was petrol. And what we have here is an access port for one of the side fuel tanks. There's 150 litres per side. If you did need to fill up, because there is no connecting piping between the external tank and the internal, you'd open the ports on both tanks, and you would then need to use a hand pump or siphon the fuel from the external to the internal. Air and ventilation. The side ports are for the ventilating air to cool down the engine, whereas the round device in the middle is the air filter, and this will clean the air going into the engine to be combusted. As we move further to the rear, this is an access port for oil, a jack, of course, with one on the other side as well, and lastly, this is the protective housing for the last of the suspension guide rods. Power transfer all happens at the rear of the tank. Now, unlike most tanks you'll see which have sprocket wheels with teeth that project out and intermesh with the track, you'll see that the BT has a solid drive wheel. There are no teeth sticking out. Instead, what it uses are a series of up to 8 rollers, only 4 are currently installed, which mesh with the center guides of the track, and this pushes the track forward and around. Now, the advantage of this is it's completely frictionless almost. The disadvantage, though, is that ultimately there's only so much force that you can put to a single piece of metal to propel a tank going forwards. So when tanks started getting heavier, you just couldn't do it anymore. Especially when there's only one center guide every other track length. Now the other disadvantage with the track design, because it is so long, the pitch of the track, there is a very large gap between the road wheel and the pivot point, the pins. What would sometimes happen is then that the track link would bend, making a very rough ride on the road wheels and also basically shortening the track a bit too much. Eventually what you would do is you'd pull out the bent track link and simply run a slightly shorter track. Now of course the other neat feature, at least neat if you're Christie, is that you could take the tracks off, as already mentioned, and run on the wheels. To do this you had to have the power transferred to the last road wheel. Now on the earlier tanks there was a chain that when you took the tracks off you added a chain to go from the drive wheel to the road wheel. By the time you got to the BT-7 however, they come up with a series of gears in a protective housing that is pretty much permanently closed, and all you had to do was pull off the hub here and instead just simply plug this geared hub into the wheel. You have now meshed with the drivetrain and your wheels are good to go. Now we come to the rear of the tank. Not much to see. Your final drive housing here. You'd open up this top bolt and that will be your oil level. Tow hooks. And finally your unditching beam. A lot of people keep asking why you have a log on the back of Russian era tanks or Soviet era tanks, and the answer is that if you get completely stuck, you take this off, chain it to the tracks at the front or the back of the tank, depending which way you wanted to go, and it would be a massive snow chain, for lack of a better term, or if you were high centered you could use that. Just go the length of the track, take it off, mount it back up again, and away you go. Now the turret was a BT-5 turret. Early versions of BT-7 would have such a turret, later ones would change. The radio antenna, as indicated by the white stripe, is a battalion commander's tank. Also on the top of the turret we have a housing for the panoramic sight, ventilator housing, and on the far right is a small little port that signal flags could be displayed to communicate with all the other tanks that weren't fortunate enough to have a radio. Two-piece main hatch. Nothing exactly complicated about it. Just lift up, lift forward, and you have a nice roomy access port to a very crowded interior. While I'm up here, the next thing I'll point out is that the rear of the turret actually swings open. This is done to allow the gun to be removed or installed. Moving further back, we have an armored ventilation housing which can be opened or closed. And finally, at the tail end are the two access ports for the main fuel tank, 400 litres. Add that to the 150 each side and you get a total of 700 litres of fuel.